Hey guys, tonight's story begins with something that sounds simple, a medieval bedroom. But the more closely we look, the less it resembles the quiet, private, softly heated room most of us imagine when we hear that word. In the Middle Ages, a bedroom could be cold, crowded, smoky, noisy, and surprisingly public. Not because people lacked any sense of comfort, but because comfort itself meant something very different. Before we settle into it, tell me where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like to drift into next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history, a like is a simple way to support this kind of work. And if calm, quietly fascinating history is your thing, you're very welcome to subscribe and stay with us. So let's step inside the medieval house, not through the castle gate first, but through the ordinary doorway where the air is colder than expected, the floor is uneven beneath your feet, and the idea of a bedroom is still slowly becoming what we think it is today. To understand why medieval bedrooms were colder, noisier, and less private, we have to begin with a small correction. Medieval people were not simply careless about comfort. They were not choosing discomfort because they did not know better. They lived within the limits of materials, money, fuel, architecture, social custom, and household labor. Their houses were shaped less by the desire for individual privacy than by the need to survive, work, store, cook, sleep, and protect everything under one roof. For many people in medieval Europe, the home was not divided into specialized rooms in the modern sense. The central space of daily life was often the hall, a large shared room where people cooked, ate, worked, received visitors, stored goods, and slept. The word bedroom can mislead us if we imagine a private chamber with a door, a quiet bed, a nightstand, and a controlled temperature. In many households, sleeping was not separated from the rhythms of the day. It was folded into them. At night, the same space that had held conversation, labor, meals, smoke, animals, tools, damp clothing, and food might become a place of rest. Bedding could be rolled out. Children might sleep near parents. Servants, apprentices, relatives, and guests might share the same room, or even the same bed, depending on status and necessity. Privacy was not absent from medieval life, but it was rarer, more negotiated, and more dependent on rank than we often assume. The first thing a modern visitor might notice would be the cold. Not the clean, dry cold of a well-insulated room with the heating turned down, but a living cold. Damp in the walls, drafts at the edges, chill rising from packed earth or stone, and smoke hanging in the air because warmth came with its own discomforts. Heat was precious. Fuel had to be gathered, purchased, stored, and rationed. Woodlands were managed carefully, and in many places firewood was not simply there for the taking. Peat, charcoal, brushwood, and straw might be used, but none of them created the effortless warmth we now expect from a room. The medieval fire was both a blessing and a problem. In poorer homes, it might burn in an open hearth near the center of the hall, with smoke finding its way upward through a roof opening, a louver, or whatever gaps the building allowed. Chimneys became more common over time, especially among wealthier households, but they were not universal in the early and high Middle Ages. Without modern insulation, the heat escaped quickly. A fire warmed bodies nearby more than it warmed the whole building. Move a few feet away, and the temperature changed. This is one of the quiet contradictions of medieval domestic life. The house could be smoky and cold at the same time. Smoke could sting the eyes, darken beams, cling to clothing, and flavor the air, while the corners of the room remained chilled. Warmth was local, uneven, and temporary. When the fire died down, the cold returned. And because fire was dangerous, it was not always left roaring through the night. Embers might be banked carefully, but a sleeping household had to balance warmth against the risk of disaster. In a world of timber, thatch, straw bedding, rushes on the floor, and open flame, fire was never merely useful. It was a threat living inside the house. A spark could become tragedy. So the medieval bedroom, when there was a distinct sleeping chamber, was not usually warmed with the steady confidence of a modern room. Braziers, hot stones, warming pans, heavy textiles, and body heat all mattered. The bed itself became a kind of shelter. For wealthier people, the bed was one of the most important pieces of furniture in the household. Could be expensive, inherited, displayed, and carefully furnished. A grand bed with curtains was not only decorative. It helped trap warmth and block drafts. Its hangings created a smaller room within the room, a soft enclosure against cold air and intrusive eyes. The canopy and curtains that later generations might see as symbols of luxury were also practical defenses against discomfort. But even this kind of comfort came with complications. Thick fabrics held smells. Bedding could harbor fleas, lice, and other pests. Mattresses stuffed with straw, wool, feathers, or other materials required maintenance. Freshness was not constant. In poorer homes, bedding might be simpler, shared, and far less protective. A person might sleep on a straw pallet, a bench, a chest, or directly near the hearth, wrapped in what clothing and coverings were available. The cold was not only inside the home. It was seasonal, regional, and social. A stone chamber in a castle could be impressive but brutally cold. Stones stored chill. High ceilings, large spaces, and defensive architecture did not naturally produce cozy interiors. Castles were built first for power, status, and protection, not for thermal comfort. Tapestries on walls did more than show taste. They softened sound, covered bare surfaces, and helped reduce drafts. Rushes on floors, wall hangings, shutters, and layered clothing all formed part of the medieval technology of warmth. And here the story becomes more interesting than a simple tale of primitive discomfort. Medieval people did not always expect indoor spaces to feel like outdoor weather had been conquered. They expected to manage cold with behavior. They wore more clothing indoors. They gathered near heat. They shared beds. They used curtains, blankets, caps, and sleeping arrangements that made warmth communal rather than mechanical. A modern bedroom isolates the individual and heats the air. A medieval sleeping space often warmed the body more directly, with wool, linen, fur, straw, another person, or the fading heat of a fire. Noise was just as inescapable. The modern bedroom is built around the idea that sleep deserves quiet. Medieval sleep often had to coexist with a household that was never fully still. In a rural home, animals might be close by, sometimes under the same roof or in adjoining spaces. Their movement, breathing, stamping, and smell were part of the environment. Chickens, pigs, cattle, dogs, and horses were not background details in medieval life. They were wealth, labor, food, protection, and survival. In towns, the noise changed but did not disappear. Streets were narrow. Walls could be thin. Workshops, carts, bells, animals, vendors, neighbors, church life, and night watchmen all formed the soundscape. Medieval towns were not quiet museums of stone and candlelight. They were dense, living places. People worked close to where they slept. Trades could be noisy. Domestic labor began early. Bells marked time not just as a convenience, but as a public ordering of the day. Inside the house, privacy was limited by architecture and by social habit. Doors were fewer. Internal partitions could be light. Rooms often connected through one another rather than through private corridors. In elite houses, chambers did exist, and status could buy separation, but even nobles were surrounded by attendants. A lord or lady might sleep in a more private chamber, yet private did not mean alone in the modern sense. Servants might sleep nearby or in the same room. Important people were dressed, undressed, guarded, advised, and served in spaces that mixed intimacy with hierarchy. This is one of the hardest things for modern viewers to imagine. Being important often meant being less alone, not more. Privacy was not always the highest luxury. Attendance was. To be surrounded by people could be a sign of rank. A noble household was a system of service and visibility. The chamber was not merely a bedroom. It was a place of controlled access, political conversation, household management, and status display. Even the royal bedchamber could be a stage. Access to the ruler's body, clothing, waking, sleeping, and daily routines could become part of court culture. This does not mean every moment was public in a crude sense, but it does mean that the boundary between personal life and social life was drawn differently. The bed could be where one slept, received visitors, conducted business, recovered from illness, gave birth, died, or displayed wealth. For ordinary people, the lack of privacy had a different character. It came less from ceremony and more from necessity. A small house could not easily create separate rooms for every family member. Children heard adults. Adults heard children. Servants and apprentices lived as part of the household. Lodgers or travelers might be taken in. Beds were expensive, and sharing one was practical. To sleep alone in a room would have seemed unusual for many people, and perhaps not always desirable. Solitude could mean vulnerability as much as comfort. The bed itself was often more social than we imagine. Sharing a bed did not automatically imply romance. It could be a practical arrangement among family members, servants, travelers, or people of the same sex. Inns commonly required strangers to share sleeping spaces. The idea that every person should have a separate bed, in a separate room, protected from interruption, is a relatively modern expectation, supported by wealth, space, fuel, furniture, and changing ideas about the self. And yet medieval people did have ideas of modesty, honor, shame, and appropriate boundaries. The absence of modern privacy does not mean the absence of social rules. On the contrary, where architecture did not provide privacy, etiquette and hierarchy often had to do more work. Who could enter a chamber, who might share a bed, who slept near the hearth, who had curtains, who had a locked chest, who was allowed near the lord or lady. All of these details mattered. This brings us to a deeper point. Medieval bedrooms were uncomfortable not simply because technology was limited, but because the whole household was organized around a different relationship between the individual and the group. Today, a bedroom is often treated as the most personal room in a home. It is a retreat, a psychological refuge, a place where the self can be private. In medieval life, the household was more openly collective. Work, kinship, rank, service, and survival pressed people together. The home was not only a domestic space. It was an economic unit. Cloth might be spun there. Food was prepared and stored there. Tools were kept there. Animals might be sheltered there. Apprentices learned there. Servants labored there. Guests were received there. Marriage, inheritance, labor, discipline, hospitality, and reputation all passed through the household. Sleeping was only one function among many. So when we ask why the medieval bedroom was colder, noisier, and less private, the answer is not one thing. It is a chain of conditions. Fuel was limited. Buildings were drafty. Fire was risky. Rooms were multipurpose. Furniture was costly. Households were crowded. Work and sleep overlapped. Status required attendance. Privacy was culturally different. And above all, the medieval home had not yet become the insulated, specialized, individual-centered space that many people now take for granted. But there is another layer, and it may be the most quietly revealing one. Medieval discomfort was not distributed evenly. The cold felt different depending on whether you slept beside a smoky hearth or behind embroidered bed curtains. Noise felt different depending on whether it came from your own animals, your master's household, a town street, or servants waiting on you. Lack of privacy felt different if it meant dependence, surveillance, protection, honor, or status. For the poor, the bedroom might barely exist as a separate category. For the wealthy, it might exist but remain porous, attended, and politically meaningful. For everyone, the night was shaped by the same basic facts. Darkness came early, artificial light was limited, winter was long, and the house had to hold more of life than a modern home usually does. As evening settled, the medieval household changed tempo rather than becoming silent. The fire dimmed. Food vessels were moved. Tools were put aside. Animals shifted in their stalls. Children settled. Servants completed late tasks. The door was secured. Bedding was arranged. The room that had been public and active became gradually more intimate, though not necessarily private. Shadows moved across beams and walls. Smoke rose slowly. Outside, bells or dogs or distant voices might still be heard. And in that dimming space, sleep arrived not as an escape into perfect comfort, but as one more act of adaptation. People slept in layers, in company, near warmth where they could find it, under roofs that breathed, leaked, creaked, and carried sound. The medieval bedroom was not a quiet, sealed chamber. It was a negotiated shelter inside a world that constantly pressed inward. And because the outside world pressed inward so easily, medieval sleep was shaped not only by architecture and temperature, but by uncertainty itself. Night was darker then in a way that modern people rarely experience. Once the fire dimmed and candles were extinguished to save expense, visibility collapsed quickly. Beyond the glow of embers, much of the house disappeared into shadow. Doors, beams, tools, animals, sleeping bodies, hanging cloth, and stored goods merged into a single indistinct darkness interrupted only by sound. This mattered more than we sometimes realize, because medieval nights were not fully separated from danger. Theft, fire, illness, weather, and sudden disturbance were ordinary concerns. A household might secure shutters and bar doors, but homes were rarely isolated from risk. Villages heard storms approaching long before they saw them. Towns heard arguments in alleyways, wagon wheels over stone, barking dogs, distant bells, and sometimes the warning cries that signaled trouble somewhere nearby. In many regions, curfews existed partly because darkness changed the character of society itself. Streets became harder to police. Fires became harder to control. Strangers became more threatening. Even familiar places became uncertain after sunset. Artificial lighting was expensive and weak. A single candle illuminated very little space. Rushlights and oil lamps offered limited help. Maintaining light required labor, fuel, wax, oil, tallow, or animal fat, all of which carried cost. So people adapted not only their homes, but their rhythms of sleep. One of the more surprising aspects of medieval nighttime life is that many people did not always sleep in one continuous block the way modern societies encourage today. Historians studying letters, court records, medical texts, and household writings have noticed recurring references to what later scholars began calling first sleep and second sleep. After several hours of rest, people might wake naturally for a period during the middle of the night before returning to sleep again. This was not necessarily insomnia in the modern sense. It appears, in some times and places, to have been ordinary enough that people spoke about it casually. During this waking interval, someone might tend the fire, pray, speak quietly with others, check animals, relieve themselves, or simply lie awake in the dimness before returning to bed. The pattern makes more sense when we remember how profoundly medieval life followed natural light. Without electric illumination extending the evening far past sunset, people often went to bed earlier, especially in winter. Long winter nights created enough darkness for sleep to divide naturally into segments. Modern expectations about uninterrupted 8-hour sleep emerged much later alongside industrial schedules, urban lighting, and changing labor systems. Again, something that initially sounds strange begins to feel practical when placed inside the material reality of the time. Even getting out of bed at night carried its own discomforts. Floors were cold. Chamber pots were commonly used because leaving the house after dark could be unpleasant or dangerous, particularly during harsh weather or in crowded towns where dedicated sanitation systems were limited. The smell inside many sleeping spaces reflected this reality. Medieval rooms were not designed around modern assumptions of ventilation and hygiene. Smoke, dampness, sweat, rushes, animals, food storage, and human waste could mingle in subtle but constant ways. Yet here too we should resist easy caricature. Medieval people did care about cleanliness, though the methods and standards differed from later centuries. Bedding was aired when possible. Linen was valued partly because it could be washed more easily than heavier outer garments. Herbs and flowers were used for scent and comfort. Floors might be strewn with fresh rushes or plants, though modern romantic images often exaggerate how pleasant this truly was over time. In wealthier homes, servants maintained chambers carefully because household reputation mattered deeply. The medieval bedroom also reflected age, gender, and family structure in ways modern audiences sometimes overlook. Childhood itself was experienced differently. Children were rarely granted long periods of private independence. They lived close to adult routines from an early age. Their sleeping arrangements reflected this. A child might sleep beside parents, siblings, servants, apprentices, or other household members depending on space and status. Marriage altered sleeping arrangements too, though perhaps not always in the sentimental way modern viewers imagine. Marriage in medieval Europe was shaped by economics, inheritance, religion, labor, and kinship as much as personal affection. Beds symbolized household formation, fertility, legitimacy, and continuity. A proper bed represented stability. It was a major possession. In wills and inventories, beds appear repeatedly because they held real financial and symbolic value. In some communities, even the rituals surrounding beds reveal how public domestic life could be. Weddings were not always followed by immediate privacy. Ceremonial bedding customs existed in certain regions and periods, especially among elites, where witnesses or attendants participated in parts of the process surrounding the marriage bed. To modern sensibilities, this can seem intrusive, but within medieval social logic, marriage was not solely a private emotional arrangement. It was a social contract involving families, property, alliances, and legitimacy. At the same time, emotional intimacy certainly existed. Medieval letters, poems, and devotional writings reveal tenderness, grief, longing, companionship, and attachment. But these feelings lived inside a world where privacy was structurally limited. People learned to carve emotional spaces within crowded physical ones. And sometimes the bedroom became the most emotionally intense room in the household precisely because so much of life converged there. People were born there. Women labored there surrounded by female relatives, midwives, neighbors, servants, and ritual customs meant to protect mother and child through a dangerous process. Childbirth remained profoundly risky throughout the medieval period. The chamber of birth was both practical and symbolic. Warmed if possible, enclosed, female-dominated for a time, filled with prayers, preparations, linens, and anxiety. People also died there. Death in medieval society was not hidden away inside professional institutions the way it often is now. The dying person frequently remained at home, in the same space where household life continued around them. Family members, clergy, servants, neighbors, and children might all be present. The bedchamber became a place of prayer, fear, legal arrangements, reconciliation, and witness. Wills were spoken there. Final confessions occurred there. Candles burned beside bodies there. This closeness to death shaped medieval sleep in subtle ways. The bedroom was not imagined only as a private refuge for relaxation. It was part of the larger cycle of household existence. Illness, birth, sex, prayer, fever, recovery, and death all unfolded within the same domestic world. Religion itself deeply influenced nighttime routines. Before sleep, prayers were common across medieval Christian Europe. Beds might be blessed. Crosses or devotional objects could hang nearby. Monastic communities structured sleep around prayer schedules so strict that rest itself became organized by spiritual discipline. Monks and nuns often rose during the night for services, interrupting sleep intentionally as part of religious life. For ordinary laypeople, nighttime could also carry spiritual unease. Darkness was associated not only with physical danger but with moral and supernatural vulnerability. Medieval belief systems included fears of demons, spirits, temptation, witchcraft, restless dead, divine punishment, and unseen forces moving through the night. These beliefs varied greatly across regions and centuries, but they formed part of the emotional texture of sleep. A creaking beam, strange animal noise, illness fever, or vivid dream could acquire meanings beyond the purely physical. Dreams themselves were often taken seriously. Some were interpreted as warnings, temptations, or spiritual messages. Religious texts discussed proper and improper dreams. Physicians connected dreams to bodily conditions and humors. The sleeping mind was not viewed as meaningless background activity. This created an interesting contradiction in medieval bedrooms. Sleep was necessary and valued, but unconsciousness also involved vulnerability. A sleeping person could be spiritually tempted, physically endangered, robbed, attacked, or overtaken by illness. In an age before modern medicine, people understood how quickly health could collapse. Fever might arrive overnight. A winter chill might become something fatal. The line between ordinary sickness and mortal danger could be frighteningly thin. And this helps explain why beds themselves became objects of such importance. To own a good bed was not a trivial luxury. It represented protection against cold, status within the household, bodily support, and even moral respectability. Inventories of wealthy homes sometimes listed bedding in extraordinary detail. Blankets, sheets, coverlets, curtains, pillows, featherbeds, furs, embroidered hangings. Textiles were expensive and labor-intensive. A furnished bed could cost more than many other household objects combined. Curtains around the bed served another subtle purpose beyond warmth. They controlled visibility inside crowded rooms. Even limited privacy had value. Drawing bed curtains allowed conversation, intimacy, prayer, illness, or sleep to happen with at least partial separation from the surrounding household. The medieval bed became, in effect, a movable architecture of fabric inside buildings that otherwise offered little isolation. Yet even among the wealthy, silence remained elusive. Castles echoed. Servants moved through corridors. Fires cracked. Animals occupied courtyards and lower levels. Wind passed through shutters. Rain sounded loudly on timber, tile, or thatch depending on the structure. Bells governed religious and civic time. Visitors arrived unpredictably. Political households remained active long after dark. And perhaps this is one of the most revealing differences between medieval and modern expectations. Today, comfort often means removing interruption. Medieval comfort more often meant managing interruption successfully. A warm blanket mattered because the room itself could not be fully controlled. Bed curtains mattered because true solitude was rare. Thick walls mattered because weather and sound intruded constantly. Sharing space mattered because isolation could itself be dangerous or impractical. Even sleep posture reflected older assumptions. Many medieval illustrations and later descriptions suggest people sometimes slept in partially upright positions, especially when ill, elderly, wealthy, or heavily layered with bedding. Historians debate exactly how widespread this was, but it likely reflected practical concerns involving warmth, breathing beliefs, digestion theories, and mattress construction rather than simple oddity. Medical ideas also shaped bedrooms. Medieval medicine inherited traditions from classical authorities like Galen and Hippocrates, emphasizing balance between bodily humors. Air quality, temperature, moisture, diet, and sleep were all connected. Bedrooms were not medically neutral spaces. Physicians advised on ventilation, bedding, sleeping habits, and nighttime behavior according to theories that attempted to preserve bodily balance. Fresh air, however, created its own paradox. Opening a room too much invited cold and damp. Closing it too tightly trapped smoke, odors, and stale air. Medieval people constantly balanced competing discomforts because they lacked modern systems capable of controlling temperature, sanitation, and airflow simultaneously. And outside elite circles, labor shaped exhaustion more than ideal sleeping conditions did. Agricultural workers, craftsmen, servants, and laborers often fell asleep because bodies demanded it, not because the environment was perfectly suited to rest. Physical fatigue could overpower noise, crowding, and discomfort. Medieval work was frequently seasonal, repetitive, and physically draining. During harvests or periods of intense labor, sleep might be taken wherever possible. Travelers experienced even greater uncertainty. Inns varied enormously in quality. Shared beds with strangers were common. Vermin were persistent problems. Theft remained a concern. Travelers sometimes slept fully clothed or kept possessions close to their bodies through the night. The ideal of the restful private room was unattainable for most people on the road. Yet despite all this, medieval people still created rituals of comfort. Warm drinks before bed, shared prayers, storytelling by the fire, protective charms, carefully layered blankets, dogs sleeping nearby for warmth, the familiar sounds of family members breathing in darkness, the relief of thick curtains against winter drafts, the faint survival of embers until morning. Comfort existed, but it was fragile, communal, and constantly negotiated against the limits of the world surrounding it. And as medieval towns expanded further, populations increased, and household structures slowly evolved toward the later Middle Ages, another transformation quietly began to reshape the meaning of private space itself. In wealthier urban homes especially, corridors, upper chambers, specialized rooms, and changing household ideals would gradually alter how sleep, family life, and domestic separation were understood, though not all at once and never evenly across society. And as medieval towns expanded further, populations increased, and household structures slowly evolved toward the later Middle Ages, another transformation quietly began to reshape the meaning of private space itself. In wealthier urban homes especially, corridors, upper chambers, specialized rooms, and changing household ideals would gradually alter how sleep, family life, and domestic separation were understood, though not all at once and never evenly across society. One of the reasons this transformation happened so slowly is that medieval buildings were constrained by more than architectural imagination. Timber, stone, labor, heating, inheritance customs, taxation, and urban crowding all influenced how homes developed. In many towns, houses were narrow because land inside walls was valuable. Buildings rose upward rather than outward. Upper stories projected over streets. Workshops occupied ground floors. Storage filled attics and side rooms. Every usable space mattered. So when additional chambers appeared, they were not automatically private retreats in the modern sense. A room could still serve multiple functions depending on the hour, season, or family circumstance. A merchant's upper chamber might hold valuables, receive trusted visitors, store textiles, and serve as sleeping space all at once. A servant might sleep near the kitchen in winter because it was warmer. Apprentices could sleep beside their work materials. Guests altered arrangements constantly. Even among the elite, architectural privacy developed unevenly. Castles and manor houses slowly evolved more complex internal layouts over centuries, but early medieval great halls remained central for a long time. The hall was political as much as domestic. It displayed authority. Meals were communal and hierarchical. Hospitality mattered enormously in aristocratic culture. To feed and house retainers, guests, and dependents was part of power itself. This meant that sleeping arrangements reflected social order. Lords and ladies gradually withdrew into more private chambers connected to the hall, but complete separation was unusual. Important visitors might still sleep nearby. Trusted servants remained close. Guards watched entrances. Household officials moved through adjoining spaces. In many noble residences, privacy existed in layers rather than absolutes. Access became more restricted the deeper one moved into the household. And this layered privacy created a fascinating social geography inside medieval homes. The hall belonged to collective life. Chambers represented increasing status and trust. Service areas belonged to labor. Kitchens operated almost as industrial spaces, hot, dangerous, and constantly active. Storerooms protected wealth. Chapels created spiritual centers within households. To move through the building was to move through hierarchy itself. Bedrooms therefore became indicators not just of comfort, but of social position. Who slept nearest the Lord? Who had curtains? Who had feather bedding instead of straw? Who slept alone, and who slept among servants or apprentices? These details mattered because they reflected a person's place within the household economy and moral order. Even sleep timing could differ according to status. Elite households often maintained later evening routines involving feasting, music, conversation, or administration. Servants rose early to restart fires, prepare food, carry water, clean chambers, and manage animals before higher-status household members fully woke. The quiet comfort of a noble bedchamber depended on invisible labor beginning long before dawn. And dawn itself was a harsher experience than modern audiences often imagine. Without central heating, medieval winter mornings could be deeply unpleasant indoors. Fires needed rekindling. Water might be icy. Clothing stored overnight could feel stiff with cold and dampness. Stone floors pulled heat from bare feet instantly. Washing, where possible, was limited by temperature and effort. The comforting image of waking slowly in a warm bedroom simply did not exist for most people. In fact, one of the most revealing differences between medieval and modern domestic life is how little separation existed between indoor and outdoor climate. Medieval buildings moderated weather somewhat, but they rarely defeated it. Winter remained physically present inside the home. Wind announced itself audibly through shutters and roof seams. Rain altered smells and textures indoors. Seasonal life entered the bedroom directly. Summer brought different discomforts. Heat trapped odors. Insects multiplied. Fleas and lice became more active. Bedding grew stifling. Air circulation remained imperfect. People adjusted with lighter linens, open shutters were safe, and changes in sleeping arrangements, but no season offered total comfort. And yet medieval people often tolerated conditions that would deeply frustrate modern sleepers. Part of this came from expectation. Comfort standards are cultural as much as physical. A person raised in a world without climate control does not experience temperature variation exactly the same way as someone accustomed to highly regulated interiors. Medieval people were sensitive to cold and heat, certainly, but they organized life around adaptation rather than elimination of discomfort. Clothing illustrates this particularly well. Modern homes allow people to dress lightly indoors year-round. Medieval indoor clothing remained layered because interior climate demanded it. Nightcaps, woolen garments, linens, and layered bedding all compensated for environmental instability. Sleeping naked, often imagined romantically in modern culture, was neither universal nor always practical in colder conditions. Beds themselves became increasingly elaborate partly because the room around them remained unreliable. The bed was the true climate-controlled space of the medieval world, at least for those who could afford one. A wealthy bed might include mattresses layered over ropes or frames, feather-filled bolsters, heavy blankets, embroidered covers, curtains, and canopies designed to trap heat. Beds were sometimes so valuable that they appeared prominently in dowries and inheritance records. A fine bed could symbolize family continuity, prosperity, and dignity. But there was another reason beds mattered so much. Many other household furnishings remained comparatively sparse. Modern people often underestimate how empty many medieval interiors were by contemporary standards. Furniture was expensive and labor-intensive. Rooms were not crowded with upholstered seating, shelving, decorative objects, and specialized equipment the way modern homes are. A bed therefore occupied enormous visual and practical importance. It dominated the chamber physically and symbolically. This partly explains why important social interactions occurred there. Receiving trusted guests in bed, while unusual to modern audiences, was not necessarily scandalous in elite medieval and early modern society. A person confined by illness, rank, childbirth recovery, or cold might conduct conversations from bed. The chamber was not fully disconnected from public life. And because sleep itself was less isolated from household rhythms, nighttime interruptions were common. Servants entered rooms to maintain fires or deliver items. Children cried. Animals disturbed sleep. Guests arrived late. Storms leaked through roofs. Bells rang for religious observances, emergencies, or timekeeping. In monasteries, nighttime prayer schedules intentionally interrupted rest. In towns, drunken voices, carts, or disputes could carry through narrow streets long after darkness fell. The medieval bedroom therefore existed inside a culture where uninterrupted silence was rare enough that people may not have expected it in the first place. This is an important psychological difference. Modern sleepers often treat noise as an intrusion into a fundamentally private space. Medieval households more often accepted background interruption as part of ordinary life. A person learned to sleep through familiar sounds while remaining alert to unusual ones. Parents listening for animals, servants listening for bells, guards listening for movement, mothers listening for infants, monks listening for signals to pray, innkeepers listening for trouble among travelers. Sleep was lighter, more communal, and more intertwined with obligation. Even dreams and nightmares acquired different emotional weight in such environments. Medieval literature and religious writings frequently describe disturbed sleep, troubling visions, spiritual anxieties, or nighttime temptations. The darkened bedroom was not psychologically neutral. It sat at the edge of the known world each night. Candles dying out altered perception profoundly. Human sight narrowed. Familiar objects became ambiguous. Medieval medicine, religion, folklore, and daily experience all interacted within this darkness. A fevered dream might feel spiritually meaningful. Sleep paralysis could be interpreted as demonic attack. Strange noises in timber walls might become signs of supernatural presence. Again, these beliefs should not be dismissed as simple ignorance. Medieval people inhabited a world where unseen causes genuinely shaped life. Disease appeared mysteriously. Weather destroyed harvests unpredictably. Death often arrived suddenly. Scientific explanations remained limited. Supernatural frameworks provided structure for uncertainty. And uncertainty entered the bedroom constantly. One especially revealing example appears during outbreaks of plague. When epidemic disease swept through medieval towns and villages, the bedroom became both refuge and prison. Families isolated the sick where they could. Beds became sites of fear as much as comfort. Shared sleeping arrangements that normally provided warmth and security suddenly carried danger. People watched relatives weaken beside them. Priests visited chambers to administer last rites. Entire households changed overnight. The Black Death in the 14th century intensified awareness of mortality within domestic spaces. Chroniclers described homes falling silent except for the sounds of illness. Beds once crowded with family life became places where survivors feared to lie beside one another. Yet necessity often overrode fear. The poor especially could not isolate effectively. Small homes forced closeness even during catastrophe. And this crisis subtly accelerated long-term changes in attitudes toward household space, cleanliness, and personal separation. Though these developments unfolded unevenly over centuries, rather than immediately after the plague, economic shifts mattered too. As trade expanded and urban merchant classes grew wealthier in some regions, domestic ideals slowly changed. Prosperous townspeople invested in more elaborate homes, imported textiles, glazed windows, carved furniture, and increasingly differentiated rooms. Comfort itself became more visibly tied to status. But there was a paradox hidden inside these improvements. As homes slowly became more private for the wealthy, household surveillance also intensified in some ways. Servants remained present. Gender expectations shaped movement within homes. Reputation mattered enormously in tightly connected communities. A woman's chamber, for example, could symbolize honor and virtue precisely because access to it carried social meaning. Bedrooms became moral spaces as well as practical ones. Religious authorities occasionally warned against excessive luxury in bedding or sleeping habits. Softness and comfort could be associated with idleness, vanity, or moral weakness. Ascetic traditions praised harder sleeping conditions. Monastic rules sometimes restricted bedding deliberately. Saints were described enduring discomfort voluntarily. This tension between comfort and morality ran quietly through medieval culture. Warmth and rest were desirable, but excessive indulgence could appear spiritually dangerous. Even among nobles, ideal behavior emphasized restraint, discipline, and order despite visible wealth. So the medieval bedroom occupied an unusual position in the moral imagination. It was a place of vulnerability, temptation, illness, marriage, childbirth, prayer, recovery, and death. A person spent some of their most physically unguarded moments there, yet it was rarely fully disconnected from household expectations or religious scrutiny. And beneath all these layers remained the simple physical fact of sleeping together for warmth. Modern audiences sometimes underestimate how economically sensible shared sleep was in colder centuries. Human bodies generate heat. Multiple people beneath heavy coverings in enclosed bed spaces retained warmth more effectively than solitary sleepers in open rooms. Privacy sacrificed warmth. Solitude sacrificed efficiency. In winter, particularly during periods later associated with the colder climatic conditions of the Little Ice Age, this mattered enormously. The irony is that many features modern viewers interpret as signs of hardship also functioned as practical technologies of survival. Bed curtains trapped heat. Shared beds conserved energy. Low ceilings retained warmth. Animals housed nearby added heat. Heavy textiles reduced drafts. Compact rooms required less fuel. Even smoke, unpleasant as it was, occasionally helped preserve roof thatching from insects and rot while also discouraging some pests inside the structure. None of this made medieval bedrooms pleasant by modern standards. But it reveals something more interesting than simple misery. Medieval domestic life evolved through compromise. People constantly balanced warmth against smoke, privacy against safety, comfort against expense, and cleanliness against limited resources. And those compromises became even more visible during winter nights in Northern Europe. When darkness stretched for long hours, fuel supplies dwindled anxiously, storms battered roofs and shutters, and entire households gathered closer together around the fragile center of heat and light that separated the human home from the freezing world outside. And those compromises became even more visible during winter nights in Northern Europe. When darkness stretched for long hours, fuel supplies dwindled anxiously, storms battered roofs and shutters, and entire households gathered closer together around the fragile center of heat and light that separated the human home from the freezing world outside. Winter exposed the medieval bedroom more honestly than any other season. In summer, discomfort could still be softened by open air, longer daylight, and outdoor labor that dispersed people across fields, roads, workshops, and markets. But winter compressed life inward. Rooms filled with bodies, damp clothing, smoke, stored food, tools, and animals. The house became less a retreat than a container holding survival itself. And in colder years, particularly from the late medieval period onward as Europe entered what historians later called the Little Ice Age, even wealthy households struggled against temperatures that modern heating systems have taught people to forget. Rivers froze more regularly. Harvest seasons shortened unpredictably. Long winters pressed on food supplies and fuel reserves. The bedroom became one of the clearest indicators of who possessed enough wealth to resist environmental hardship and who did not. This did not always mean grand luxury versus total misery. Often the differences were quieter. A prosperous merchant family might have glazed windows that reduced drafts slightly better than wooden shutters alone. They might own thicker wool blankets, feather mattresses, imported textiles, and enclosed bedsteads with curtains. They might have servants who pre-warmed bedding with heated stones or metal warming pans filled with embers. A poorer household nearby might rely on straw pallets near the hearth and whatever coverings could be patched together through years of use. But neither environment resembled modern indoor comfort. The warming pan itself is a revealing object. To modern eyes, it can look oddly ceremonial. A long-handled metal pan carried through a cold room before bedtime. Yet its existence quietly demonstrates how difficult it was to make a bed comfortable in winter. Sheets and blankets could become painfully cold in unheated chambers. Servants in elite households sometimes moved warming pans between beds before sleep, carefully heating the fabric without igniting it. Even luxury required constant labor, and labor shaped nearly every aspect of medieval nighttime life. Someone gathered the fuel. Someone banked the fire. Someone cleaned the rushes. Someone aired bedding when weather allowed. Someone repaired blankets and linens. Someone carried chamber pots. Someone closed shutters before storms. Someone rose before dawn to restart warmth for the rest of the household. Comfort, even limited comfort, rested on human effort. This becomes especially important when we look at gender inside the medieval home. Women's labor, particularly in non-elite households, played a central role in maintaining sleeping spaces. Linen production alone involved immense amounts of work. Spinning, weaving, washing, repairing, storing, and protecting fabric from dampness, insects, and decay. Bedding represented labor converted into survival. The medieval bedroom, therefore, cannot be understood only through architecture. It was also built from invisible maintenance. A blanket did not simply exist. Wool had to be sheared, cleaned, spun, woven, traded, or sewn. Straw bedding had to be replaced periodically because it deteriorated, flattened, and attracted pests. Curtains required textile production so expensive that they became status symbols. Even candles demanded resources from animals or beeswax production. This is one reason medieval inventories and wills often sound unexpectedly detailed when describing household textiles. Beds and linens carried enormous economic value because replacing them was difficult. And yet, even expensive beds remained vulnerable to one persistent medieval reality: infestation. Fleas, lice, mites, and bedbugs were familiar companions in many sleeping spaces regardless of class, though wealth could reduce exposure somewhat. Shared bedding, animal proximity, infrequent bathing by modern standards, and limited methods of pest control created constant problems. Medieval people were not unaware of this. Household guides, medical texts, and practical advice all addressed vermin in various ways. Herbs, smoke, cleaning methods, and sunlight were used where possible. Still, a perfectly hygienic sleeping environment was nearly impossible. This is another place where modern assumptions can quietly distort the past. Medieval people did not necessarily accept infestation with indifference. They simply lacked fully effective solutions. Their standards of cleanliness operated within technological and environmental constraints very different from ours. And interestingly, medieval sleep culture reveals how adaptable human beings are when shared discomfort becomes normal. Noise, smell, temperature fluctuation, interrupted sleep, crowded rooms, and irregular schedules could all coexist with meaningful rest because expectations differed. A modern hotel guest disturbed by faint hallway sounds would likely struggle in conditions many medieval households considered ordinary. But there was also resilience in familiarity. The sound of livestock beneath the house might reassure a farming family that their wealth remained safe nearby. The crackling hearth signaled warmth continuing through the night. Familiar breathing in a crowded room confirmed that loved ones survived another difficult winter day. Shared sleeping spaces carried emotional comfort alongside inconvenience. In some ways, medieval bedrooms were psychologically less isolated than modern ones. Today, sleep often happens behind closed doors in carefully individualized spaces. Medieval sleep more often occurred inside collective life. A child waking from fear was already near adults. Elderly relatives remained within earshot. Illness was witnessed directly rather than hidden. Loneliness, while certainly possible in medieval life, was not reinforced by architectural separation in quite the same way. This does not mean medieval households were emotionally harmonious. Crowding created tension as well as closeness. Domestic conflict had few places to disappear. Servants endured surveillance and limited autonomy. Women often carried exhausting burdens of labor and childbirth. Children experienced discipline publicly. Privacy from authority barely existed in many homes. But the emotional texture of communal sleeping arrangements was complicated. Shared space could feel oppressive, comforting, necessary, frustrating, protective, or humiliating depending on circumstance. Travel literature and court records occasionally reveal these tensions vividly. Guests complained about overcrowded inns. Servants were accused of theft committed during shared sleeping arrangements. Disputes emerged over access to beds, blankets, or chamber space. In some legal cases, sleeping arrangements themselves became evidence because households were so physically intertwined that witnesses naturally observed one another's nightly routines. And the more closely historians examine medieval bedrooms, the more they discover how deeply domestic space reflected social inequality. A peasant family sleeping beside stored grain and livestock experienced cold and exposure differently from aristocrats sleeping beneath embroidered canopies. Yet even nobles lacked forms of comfort modern middle-class homes now provide routinely. The medieval aristocrat might sleep on costly fabrics while still hearing wind whistle through stone corridors all night. A wealthy merchant might own imported carpets yet still battle smoke accumulation and winter dampness. A monastery might maintain disciplined sleeping quarters while remaining physically austere and bitterly cold. Material improvement did not eliminate environmental vulnerability so much as soften it unevenly. This becomes particularly clear in castles, which modern imagination often treats as luxurious medieval residences. In reality, many castles were acoustically harsh, draft-filled, and difficult to heat efficiently. Their thick stone walls offered protection, but stone absorbed cold relentlessly. Large ceremonial halls were impressive for gatherings yet impractical for comfort. Smaller private chambers improved conditions somewhat, especially with tapestries and enclosed beds, but true coziness remained elusive. Even royal households traveled frequently partly because maintaining comfort, supplies, and political authority required movement between residences. Medieval kings and nobles often lived itinerant lives, carrying portions of their households with them. Beds, textiles, and furnishings could travel because comfort was portable in ways architecture was not. The famous bed in medieval culture was therefore less just a location than a managed environment. Curtains enclosed warmth. Fabrics softened surfaces. Layers trapped heat. Servants maintained conditions. Portable objects created familiarity inside unfamiliar rooms. And familiarity mattered deeply in a world where travel remained exhausting and uncertain. At inns, monasteries, manor houses, and castles alike, the quality of a bed shaped how travelers judged hospitality. A warm place to sleep signaled status, generosity, and civilized order. Offering bedding to guests was morally important in Christian Europe. Hospitality traditions carried religious and social significance far beyond simple convenience. Yet the guest rarely slept alone. A medieval innkeeper maximizing limited space might place several unrelated travelers together. Large communal sleeping rooms were common. Snoring, coughing, talking, fleas, arguments, drunkenness, and theft formed part of the nighttime experience of travel. Wealthier travelers sometimes paid extra for private accommodations when available, but true isolation remained rare. And perhaps this explains why the idea of silence itself carried such unusual value. Modern people often think of luxury historically in terms of gold, silk, or elaborate decoration. But in practice, some of the rarest luxuries in medieval life were warmth, stillness, predictability, and controlled privacy. A quiet, heated chamber with limited interruption represented extraordinary privilege because it required space, labor, architecture, fuel, and social power simultaneously. Most people instead learned to exist inside layered soundscapes. The sounds of sleeping medieval households were remarkably dense. Fire settling in the hearth, mice inside walls, animals shifting below, wind against shutters, distant church bells marking prayer hours, people coughing in smoke-heavy interiors, babies crying, timber creaking as temperatures changed, water dripping through roofs during rain, servants rising before dawn, footsteps on wooden galleries above shared halls. And layered over all of this was smell, which modern historical imagination often neglects because it is difficult to reconstruct emotionally. The medieval bedroom smelled alive. Smoke from hearth fires entered textiles permanently. Damp wool carried odor after rain. Rushes on floors absorbed spills and organic waste over time. Leather, animals, sweat, candle wax, stored food, wet shoes, sickness, herbs, and human breath all occupied enclosed winter air together. But medieval people did not experience these smells exactly as modern people would. Familiarity changes perception. Some scents that seem overwhelming to modern noses were ordinary background conditions to them. Meanwhile, pleasant scents carried particular importance precisely because they contrasted so strongly with daily life. Herbs strewn on floors, flowers in season, fresh linens, incense in wealthy homes or churches. These experiences could feel intensely meaningful. The church itself influenced bedroom culture more than we sometimes notice. Religious calendars regulated daily rhythms. Feast days altered routines. Fast days affected evening meals and sleep. Bells structured time even for people without clocks. Monastic practices influenced broader attitudes toward discipline, rest, sexuality, and bodily behavior. Confession manuals and moral writings sometimes discussed sleeping arrangements directly. Clergy worried about sexual temptation, idleness, improper behavior among servants, and moral discipline within households. Beds therefore became spiritually monitored spaces as well as physical ones. And despite the crowded realities of medieval homes, there was still a growing fascination among elites with controlled intimacy. By the later Middle Ages, aristocratic and wealthy urban households increasingly valued chambers that allowed select withdrawal from public household life. Personal devotion, reading, private conversation, and more selective social access slowly gained prestige. Architectural innovations reflected this gradual cultural shift. Smaller heated rooms appeared more frequently. Windows improved slowly in affluent homes. Furniture diversified. Textile use expanded. Domestic interiors became more differentiated. But the transition was uneven and incomplete. The collective household remained central. Servants still moved constantly through domestic space. Labor still shaped every room. Cold still entered buildings easily. Darkness still governed behavior after sunset. And outside wealthy circles, most ordinary people continued living in conditions where sleeping remained deeply communal, environmentally exposed, and physically uncomfortable by modern standards. Yet even there, change was beginning quietly. As towns grew denser and commercial life expanded, new pressures emerged around property, reputation, domestic order, and household separation. Urban regulations increasingly addressed fire risks, building materials, street sanitation, and nighttime behavior. The organization of homes slowly adapted in response. And with those changes came another subtle transformation. People gradually began imagining the bedroom not merely as a place where sleep happened, but as a space increasingly connected to personal identity, household respectability, and controlled domestic life. An idea that would continue evolving long after the medieval world itself began to fade into the early modern age. And with those changes came another subtle transformation. People gradually began imagining the bedroom not merely as a place where sleep happened, but as a space increasingly connected to personal identity, household respectability, and controlled domestic life. An idea that would continue evolving long after the medieval world itself began to fade into the early modern age. But before that transformation fully arrived, there was still the deeply physical reality of medieval nights themselves, and few things reveal that reality more clearly than the simple act of trying to stay warm until morning. Modern heating systems create an illusion that warmth is stable. Medieval warmth was temporary. It moved. It weakened. It disappeared unexpectedly. A roaring fire in the evening could leave behind bitter cold by dawn if fuel had been rationed carefully overnight. A storm could penetrate weak points in roofing or shutters. Dampness entered buildings almost invisibly, settling into blankets, clothing, and timber over long winters. People slept with an awareness of heat loss that modern indoor life rarely requires. The position of the bed mattered. Distance from the hearth mattered. Drafts mattered. Curtains mattered. The number of bodies beneath blankets mattered. Even sleeping caps mattered because significant body heat escaped through the head in unheated rooms. And this practical relationship with cold influenced architecture in subtle ways. Medieval houses often had relatively small windows not only because glass was expensive, but because openings leaked heat. Thick walls helped somewhat, though stone interiors remained cold to the touch. Timber houses warmed more quickly but carried greater fire risk. Upper floors sometimes trapped heat better than lower spaces, encouraging certain sleeping arrangements during winter. Yet no arrangement entirely solved the problem. There are surviving accounts from later medieval and early modern Europe describing ice forming inside rooms, water freezing overnight indoors, and sleepers waking to visible frost in severe winters. These were not everyday conditions everywhere, but they remind us how porous the medieval home remained to the climate outside. And still, daily life continued through these conditions with remarkable regularity. People married, raised children, prayed, argued, recovered from illness, and grew old inside rooms that modern viewers might struggle to tolerate for even a few nights. Part of this endurance came from habit, but part came from social expectation. Medieval people were not pursuing constant physical ease as a primary organizing principle of domestic life. Survival, labor, morality, family continuity, and social order ranked higher. Comfort existed within those systems rather than replacing them. This is especially visible in the sleeping lives of servants. Large households often depended on servants who experienced the house very differently from its owners. Elite bedchambers could be softened with textiles, warmed with prepared fires, and shielded from some disturbances, while servants slept in corridors, lofts, kitchens, storerooms, or shared chambers with little separation from work itself. Many servants effectively lived inside the machinery of the household. Their nights remained tied to responsibility. Fires required tending. Doors required securing. Water might need carrying before dawn. Animals demanded attention regardless of weather. A servant's sleep was often conditional, interruptible, and publicly supervised. And because servants usually slept close to one another, privacy remained limited even in sleep. This created another strange paradox of medieval domestic life. The people who labored most intensely to maintain comfort often experienced the least of it themselves. In monasteries and convents, meanwhile, sleeping arrangements reflected discipline rather than status. Dormitory-style sleeping quarters remained common for long periods, particularly in stricter monastic traditions. Beds could be simple and intentionally austere. Silence at night was regulated carefully. Candles might be restricted. Clothing was often slept in partially or fully depending on the order and era. Monastic sleep reveals something important about medieval attitudes toward the body. Rest was necessary, but too much bodily comfort could be morally suspicious. Medieval Christianity inherited deep traditions of asceticism that associated hardship with spiritual discipline. Some religious figures deliberately embraced uncomfortable sleeping conditions as acts of devotion. Saintly biographies describe holy individuals sleeping on hard surfaces, reducing blankets, or interrupting sleep with prayer. Whether every detail was literal mattered less than the cultural message being communicated. Comfort was spiritually ambiguous. And yet, the average medieval person still sought comfort wherever possible. This tension runs quietly through the entire history of the medieval bedroom. Warmth and softness were desired, but also morally monitored. Privacy was useful, but excessive isolation could appear suspicious. Luxury demonstrated status, but too much luxury invited criticism. The bedroom became a place where physical needs and moral expectations constantly intersected. Even dreams were interpreted through this framework. Medical theory linked dreams to diet, bodily imbalance, emotions, and sleeping position. Religious thinkers worried about sinful dreams, temptations, and spiritual vulnerability during sleep. Ordinary people paid attention to recurring dreams because they lived in a world where divine signs, omens, and supernatural intervention felt plausible within daily life. A nightmare in a cold, dark room carried emotional force partly because medieval nights themselves were already unsettling. Darkness was not softened by streetlights, glowing electronics, or central heating humming quietly in the background. Once the fire dimmed, much of the visible world vanished. This affected social behavior after sunset more than modern people often realize. The medieval household contracted inward at night. Work slowed. Travel became riskier. Public activity narrowed. Families gathered near heat and light because those resources were concentrated. Bedrooms therefore inherited the emotional atmosphere of enclosure. They were places where the outside world became distant but never entirely absent. Storms could still be heard clearly. Animals could still become restless. Drunken voices might echo through town streets. Church bells interrupted the darkness at regular intervals. And in some regions, fear of fire remained so intense that entire nighttime routines developed around preventing disaster. A single overturned candle or neglected ember could destroy homes packed tightly together, especially in timber-built towns. Medieval urban authorities frequently worried about nighttime fires because once flames spread through dense streets, containment became extraordinarily difficult. This helps explain why nighttime lighting remained cautious despite darkness. Candles cost money, but they also carried risk. Many households reduced lighting deliberately before sleep. Moving through a medieval house at night often meant relying on memory and touch as much as vision. And here we encounter another subtle but important difference between medieval and modern bedrooms. Medieval interiors were not designed primarily around nighttime use. Today, bedrooms remain fully functional after dark because artificial light allows nearly uninterrupted activity. Medieval sleeping spaces changed character dramatically once evening deepened. Visibility narrowed to the immediate reach of flame. Objects disappeared into shadow. Activities simplified. This altered the psychology of nighttime itself. People often went to bed not because they were fully tired in the modern sense, but because darkness made many activities impractical. Long winter nights therefore produced extended periods of rest, conversation, prayer, storytelling, intimacy, and intermittent sleep, rather than the compressed nighttime schedules familiar to industrial societies. And this slower rhythm created a different relationship between time and the bedroom. Without precise personal clocks for most people, time was experienced more communally and approximately. Church bells structured hours externally. Dawn and dusk mattered deeply. Seasonal variation transformed sleeping patterns naturally. Winter encouraged longer indoor evenings. Summer labor shortened sleep opportunities during busy agricultural periods. Bedrooms therefore participated directly in the agricultural calendar. Harvest seasons exhausted bodies. Winter confined them. Spring altered waking rhythms with changing daylight. Autumn introduced anxieties about food storage, weather, and fuel preparation. The sleeping room reflected all of it. In peasant households especially, the line between domestic space and economic survival remained extremely thin. Grain storage, tools, livestock care, textile work, and food preservation all affected the sleeping environment. A failed harvest might mean colder rooms because fuel became scarce. Hunger altered sleep physically. Illness spread more easily through crowded households weakened by poor nutrition. And still, medieval communities developed deeply rooted customs around hospitality and shared shelter. To refuse someone warmth or sleeping space in harsh conditions could carry moral consequences. Christian teaching emphasized charity toward travelers, the poor, and pilgrims. Monasteries maintained guest accommodations partly for this reason. Households often absorbed relatives, servants, laborers, or displaced people during difficult times. The bedroom, crowded as it already was, became even more socially flexible during crisis. Wars intensified this instability further. Military campaigns moved constantly across parts of medieval Europe, displacing populations and disrupting ordinary domestic life. Soldiers might requisition homes. Refugees crowded into towns. Castles filled with additional retainers during danger. Households adapted sleeping arrangements repeatedly in response to insecurity. And insecurity was not rare. Modern audiences sometimes unconsciously imagine medieval homes as fixed, stable environments, but many households lived close to economic or environmental vulnerability. Illness, crop failure, political violence, fire, or taxation could reshape domestic life suddenly. Bedrooms reflected this instability because they were built from available resources rather than permanent abundance. A family that lost income might sell bedding. A widow might take in lodgers. Servants might be dismissed. Rooms could change function quickly depending on survival needs. The medieval bedroom was therefore less static than modern bedrooms tend to be. It adapted continuously to changing household conditions. Children especially experienced this fluidity. A child's sleeping arrangements could change repeatedly through life, beside parents in infancy, among siblings later, into apprenticeship households during adolescence, or into service positions elsewhere. The idea of a permanently personal childhood bedroom barely existed for most people. And yet attachment to certain sleeping objects could become emotionally powerful precisely because stability was rare. A familiar blanket, a family bed passed through generations, a chest holding linens prepared for marriage, curtains inherited from parents. These possessions represented continuity in uncertain lives. Textiles in particular carried emotional meaning because they moved through major life events. Marriage beds symbolized new households. Funeral linens accompanied death rituals. Birth chambers required prepared fabrics. Embroidered bedding displayed both wealth and familial identity. The bedroom therefore functioned not merely as shelter, but as a stage upon which medieval life cycles unfolded repeatedly. Birth, marriage, illness, aging, death, prayer, recovery, inheritance, all passed through the same confined domestic spaces. And because of this, medieval people often experienced the bedroom less as a private personal retreat than as a deeply social and symbolic environment tied to family continuity itself. This social dimension becomes especially visible in noble and royal households where sleeping arrangements intersected directly with politics. In elite courts, physical proximity to rulers mattered enormously. Trusted attendants guarded chambers, assisted with clothing, and controlled access. The bedchamber became part of governance. Influence could depend on who was allowed near the ruler during vulnerable private moments. To modern viewers, this can feel strangely invasive, but medieval political culture operated through personal relationships more than abstract bureaucratic systems. Access to the ruler's household carried real power. Privacy, in the modern sense, was often sacrificed to visibility, ritual, and control. And ironically, even kings sometimes struggled to sleep peacefully because of this constant proximity. Court life remained noisy, mobile, crowded, and politically tense. Servants moved continuously. Petitioners waited nearby. Security concerns remained constant. Royal residences housed enormous numbers of people by modern standards. The medieval elite could purchase softer bedding and warmer chambers, but not necessarily quiet solitude. And beneath every level of society remained the same persistent truth. Nighttime was never fully separated from the demands of the world outside the bed. A merchant might wake worrying about debts or shipments delayed by weather. A farmer listened anxiously for storms threatening livestock. A mother checked whether a feverish child still breathed normally. A monk rose for prayer in freezing darkness. A servant rekindled a dying hearth before dawn. A watchman heard distant footsteps through narrow streets. A traveler shifted uneasily beside strangers in a crowded inn. The medieval bedroom held all of these, and as Europe slowly moved toward the 15th and 16th centuries, those rhythms would begin changing again under the pressure of expanding trade, shifting household ideals, evolving architecture, and new expectations about comfort that would gradually reshape what people believed a bedroom ought to be. But change in domestic life rarely arrives all at once. Long before medieval bedrooms became recognizably modern, people first had to imagine that a sleeping space could serve something beyond basic shelter, status, and survival. And that shift began quietly, almost invisibly, in the details of household design. Experiences together. Not as isolated stories, but as part of one larger world where sleep itself remained collective, vulnerable, and inseparable from the rhythms of labor, climate, hierarchy, and survival. And as Europe slowly moved toward the 15th and 16th centuries, those rhythms would begin changing again under the pressure of expanding trade, shifting household ideals, evolving architecture, and new expectations about comfort that would gradually reshape what people believed a bedroom ought to be. And as Europe slowly moved toward the 15th and 16th centuries, those rhythms would begin changing again under the pressure of expanding trade, shifting household ideals, evolving architecture, and new expectations about comfort that would gradually reshape what people believed a bedroom ought to be. But change in domestic life rarely arrives all at once. Long before medieval bedrooms became recognizably modern, people first had to imagine that a sleeping space could serve something beyond basic shelter, status, and survival. And that shift began quietly, almost invisibly, in the details of household design. One of the clearest signs was the gradual spread of specialized rooms among wealthier households. Medieval homes had always contained different spaces, of course, but increasingly those spaces became more functionally distinct. Instead of one great shared hall dominating all domestic life, larger houses slowly developed layered interiors. Parlors, withdrawing chambers, private closets, separate kitchens, accounting rooms, and more carefully controlled sleeping quarters. The important word there is controlled. Control over temperature, control over sound, control over access, control over who could enter, observe, or interrupt. These were luxuries as meaningful as expensive fabrics or silver tableware. In many ways, the later medieval and early modern bedroom became a technology of selective separation. Yet even this separation remained incomplete. Servants still moved through elite households continuously. Noble families often slept near attendants. Children frequently shared space with nurses, siblings, or servants. Apprentices and laborers remained integrated into household systems. But the direction of change had begun. And strangely enough, one of the forces accelerating that change was commerce. As trade networks expanded across Europe, imported goods slowly altered domestic expectations. Carpets, finer textiles, better glazing techniques, improved furniture craftsmanship, and more sophisticated metalwork entered wealthy homes through expanding markets. Urban merchant classes increasingly competed with older aristocracies not only through public display, but through interior refinement. Comfort itself became more visible. A chamber lined with textiles felt warmer and quieter. A glazed window reduced drafts. A carved bedstead with thick curtains enclosed the sleeper more effectively. Padded furnishings softened hard interiors. None of these innovations eliminated medieval discomfort entirely, but together they changed what prosperous households expected from domestic life. And expectations matter historically more than we sometimes realize. Once people begin imagining greater comfort as possible, older conditions can start to feel less inevitable. A merchant visiting an affluent Italian city might return home newly conscious of colder interiors elsewhere. A noblewoman exposed to luxurious Burgundian textiles might expect similar refinements in her own chambers. Royal courts spread fashion not only through clothing, but through furniture, decoration, and domestic arrangement. Bedrooms became aspirational spaces. But the irony is that these refinements emerged during a period when ordinary urban life often became even more crowded. Late medieval towns could be intensely dense environments. Houses leaned close over narrow streets. Workshops operated beside living quarters. Population recovery after plague outbreaks gradually refilled urban centers. Lodgers crowded into homes. Migrant laborers and servants sought shelter wherever possible. So while elite bedrooms slowly gained privacy, many ordinary people experienced the opposite. Inns grew busier. Rental rooms subdivided. Families shared increasingly limited space. And urban noise intensified. The soundscape of a late medieval town at night could be remarkably complex. Iron-shod wheels rattled across stone streets. Tavern noise spilled into alleys. Watchmen called the hours. Church bells regulated both civic and religious time. Animals moved constantly through urban spaces. Smiths, bakers, brewers, and other trades often worked at hours shaped by heat, demand, or available daylight. The bedroom never floated above these sounds. It absorbed them. Even wealthy homes could not fully exclude urban life because cities themselves remained acoustically porous. Windows closed imperfectly. Walls transmitted vibration. Courtyards amplified sound. Servants entered and exited at all hours. And unlike modern cities shaped by engines and electrical systems, medieval noise often came directly from human bodies, animals, tools, and voices. It was intimate noise, arguments between neighbors, footsteps on timber stairs, someone coughing through the night, a baby crying in the next room, the scrape of furniture overhead, prayers murmured before sleep that in many homes. Silence itself might have felt unsettling because people were so accustomed to communal sound. This becomes especially important when considering how differently medieval people understood solitude. Today, being alone in a bedroom is often associated with rest, autonomy, and emotional recovery. Medieval Europeans did not necessarily experience prolonged solitude positively. To be physically isolated could imply vulnerability, punishment, poverty, illness, widowhood, or social abandonment. Even hermits and religious recluses who sought solitude were regarded as unusual precisely because separation from ordinary household life was spiritually extreme. For most people, safety came from embeddedness within a household. The crowded medieval bedroom, therefore, reflected more than material limitation. It reflected a society organized around interdependence. Children depended on parents and kin. Servants depended on masters. Apprentices depended on workshops. Elderly relatives depended on extended households. Travelers depended on hospitality. The isolated nuclear household familiar to many modern societies was far less common. And because labor remained overwhelmingly domestic in structure, work and sleep rarely separated cleanly. Textile production, food preparation, bookkeeping, tool repair, and storage all occurred inside homes. Bedrooms existed beside labor rather than away from it. This is one reason nighttime could feel strangely unfinished. A modern bedroom often marks a clear psychological transition out of public obligation. Medieval sleeping spaces remained partially entangled with unfinished work. Bread dough might be rising nearby. Cloth might await repair at dawn. Animals required attention before sunrise. Illness interrupted rest unpredictably. Fires demanded management. Even dreams sometimes reflected labor anxieties. Medieval writings occasionally describe people dreaming about debts, harvests, storms, legal disputes, or religious fears because household survival depended on so many uncertain factors. And uncertainty intensified during periods of political instability. Wars in late medieval Europe repeatedly disrupted ordinary domestic life. Raiding armies destroyed villages. Taxation increased. Refugees crowded towns. Trade routes became dangerous. Castles and city walls offered some protection but also concentrated populations under stressful conditions. Bedrooms adapted accordingly. Families stored valuables near sleeping areas for safety. Weapons might remain accessible overnight. Crowded households took in displaced relatives or retainers. Sleep became lighter during periods of danger. The line between domestic and defensive space could narrow quickly. In frontier regions or unstable territories, people sometimes slept partially clothed or near exits because emergencies could erupt suddenly. A peaceful, uninterrupted night was never entirely guaranteed. And despite all this instability, medieval households still pursued beauty. This is easy to miss when focusing on hardship, but even modest homes often contained attempts at decoration, comfort, and emotional warmth. Embroidered linens, carved chests, painted walls, woven hangings, polished metal objects, religious images, or carefully arranged bedding all reveal a desire to make sleeping spaces meaningful rather than merely functional. A bedroom could express identity. A newly married couple displayed household ambition through bedding quality. A noble chamber communicated lineage and status through heraldic textiles. A devotional image near the bed signaled religious commitment. A carefully maintained chest demonstrated order and respectability. These details mattered because medieval homes were among the few spaces where ordinary people exercised some control over their environment, however limited. And yet control remained fragile. One severe winter, one failed harvest, one illness, one fire, one war, one death of a wage earner. Any of these could destabilize an entire household rapidly. This fragility shaped emotional life inside medieval bedrooms in ways difficult to reconstruct fully. People slept beside uncertainty constantly. Parents knew children might not survive adulthood. Disease moved unpredictably through communities. Medical treatment remained limited. Childbirth carried danger. Hunger remained possible even in ordinary years for many people. The bedroom therefore became a place where hope and fear coexisted intimately. A mother listening to an infant breathe through the night. An elderly man coughing through winter fever. A servant worrying about dismissal. A merchant calculating debts before sleep. A widow alone in a bed once shared. A monk waking before dawn prayer in freezing silence. These experiences unfolded within environments that modern audiences would often consider physically intolerable, yet medieval people still built emotional worlds inside them. And perhaps this is one reason surviving descriptions of luxurious beds become so emotionally charged. When chroniclers describe magnificent royal beds hung with silk or lined with fur, they are not merely describing decoration. They are describing victory over discomfort. Warmth itself carried prestige. Softness carried prestige. Controlled quiet carried prestige. The medieval elite displayed comfort publicly because comfort remained rare enough to signify power. Even the arrangement of curtains around beds symbolized privilege. Curtains did not merely conceal. They insulated. They blocked drafts. They softened sound slightly. They created boundaries inside crowded rooms. To sleep enclosed by heavy fabric while servants remained exposed in colder corners of the household visually reinforced hierarchy every night. And yet servants, apprentices, and laborers often possessed something elites sometimes lacked: practical familiarity with physical hardship. A noble raised in luxury might suffer intensely during military campaigns or difficult travel because elite domestic life had insulated them somewhat from exposure. Chronicles occasionally mention aristocrats struggling with cold, rough lodging, or interrupted sleep during wartime. Meanwhile, ordinary laborers endured discomfort as routine. This should not be romanticized. Hardship remained hardship, but adaptation changes experience. Medieval peasants, servants and craftsmen developed habits, clothing strategies, sleeping arrangements, and seasonal rhythms fitted to environments modern people would find exhausting. Still, even adaptation had limits. Cold killed. Smoke damaged lungs and eyes. Crowding spread disease. Poor bedding worsened illness. Exhaustion weakened bodies. The medieval bedroom was not simply uncomfortable in theory. It shaped health materially. Respiratory illness was common in smoky interiors. Damp conditions aggravated sickness. Parasites spread easily through shared bedding. Sleep interruption affected physical resilience even if people normalized it culturally. Medical theory recognized some of these connections, though through frameworks different from modern science. Physicians advised on air circulation, bed orientation, sleeping posture, diet before sleep, and the emotional state appropriate for rest. Wealthier households increasingly consulted medical expertise when arranging chambers for the sick. And the sick room itself became one of the most important variations of the medieval bedroom. Illness transformed household space immediately. Curtains closed around the patient. Fires were adjusted carefully. Bedding changed. Medicines, herbs, and devotional objects accumulated nearby. Family members maintained watches through the night. Priests arrived for confession or prayer. In serious illness, the bedroom became emotionally public even when physically enclosed. Relatives gathered. Witnesses listened. Servants moved quietly. Candles burned beside beds. Instructions about property, debts, and inheritance were spoken there. The dying person rarely disappeared into institutional medical spaces because such institutions barely existed in the modern sense. Death remained domestic. And because death remained domestic, the bedroom carried emotional memory in unusually direct ways. Beds passed through generations not only as furniture, but as witnesses to births, marriages, illnesses, reconciliations, and deaths. Sleeping spaces accumulated family history physically. A chest beside the bed might contain linens prepared decades earlier. Curtains might survive from an earlier marriage. A room might still carry associations with previous generations. This continuity gave medieval domestic interiors a dense emotional texture despite their material simplicity. And interestingly, as the late medieval period moved gradually toward the Renaissance, written advice about household management began paying more attention to order, refinement, and regulated domestic behavior. Courtesy literature expanded. Conduct manuals discussed proper sleeping arrangements, servant discipline, household cleanliness, and respectable domestic presentation. The bedroom slowly became part of a broader moral vision of organized household life. Not merely survival, not merely shelter, but controlled domestic order. This did not mean ordinary people suddenly enjoyed quiet private rooms. Most did not, but culturally the ideal itself was shifting. Wealthier Europeans increasingly valued chambers separated from noise, specialized sleeping furniture, and more regulated household circulation. Architecture responded gradually. Hall-centered living declined slowly in some regions. Corridors became more common. Private staircases appeared in elite homes. Windows improved. Fireplaces spread more widely. And with each small change, nighttime life altered slightly too. A room that retained heat longer changed sleeping habits. A quieter chamber encouraged different expectations about interruption. A lockable door changed ideas about privacy. A separate bed for children altered family dynamics. These developments unfolded over generations rather than decades, and unevenly across Europe. Rural peasants often retained older communal arrangements long after urban elites adopted newer domestic ideals. But the direction of movement was unmistakable. The medieval bedroom, once overwhelmingly collective, multifunctional, and environmentally exposed, was beginning a slow transformation into something more individualized, more insulated, and more psychologically private. Though for most people, that transformation remained far from complete, and on cold nights in crowded towns or isolated villages, the old realities of smoke, noise, darkness, shared warmth, and restless interrupted sleep still governed the hours between dusk and dawn. And perhaps nowhere was this contrast between old and new more visible than in the growing divide between urban elites and the rural majority. By the late medieval period, wealthy merchants in cities like Florence, Bruges, Paris, or London could increasingly purchase comforts that earlier generations would have considered extraordinary. Imported fabrics softened interiors. Glass windows appeared more regularly in affluent homes. Carved bedsteads became more elaborate. Domestic privacy gained social prestige. But outside these pockets of wealth, much older patterns continued with remarkable persistence. A peasant household in a northern village might still gather around a central hearth much as their ancestors had generations earlier. Livestock remained nearby in winter. Bedding was shared. Storage, work, cooking, and sleep occupied overlapping spaces. A single fire continued to define the geography of warmth within the home. This unevenness matters because the medieval world was never one unified experience. Climate, wealth, geography, and local tradition shaped bedrooms differently across Europe. A stone manor in England, a timber farmhouse in Scandinavia, an urban merchant residence in Italy, and a peasant cottage in Eastern Europe all produced different sleeping environments even within the same broad historical era. And climate altered everything. In colder northern regions, heavy bedding and enclosed bed designs became especially important. Box beds, partially enclosed wooden sleeping compartments found later in parts of northern Europe, reflected practical responses to difficult winters and shared interiors. These sleeping spaces trapped warmth efficiently inside otherwise cold houses. To modern eyes, they can appear strangely cramped, almost claustrophobic. But inside a poorly heated room, enclosure meant survival. The small protected pocket of warmth inside a bed curtain or enclosed frame could feel profoundly comforting after hours spent in freezing air. Meanwhile, in warmer southern climates, ventilation mattered more. Mediterranean homes developed different relationships with airflow, courtyards, shutters, and sleeping arrangements suited to heat rather than severe winter cold. Yet even there, privacy remained limited for many households, and nighttime noise still penetrated urban life easily. The medieval bedroom was therefore not one thing, but a spectrum of adaptations to local realities. Still, certain themes repeated almost everywhere. Shared sleep, environmental exposure, limited privacy, and the constant negotiation between comfort and practicality. One detail that reveals this especially well is the simple matter of waking up. Modern people often wake into environments already prepared for the day. Central heating maintains temperature overnight. Electric lights erase darkness instantly. Water flows automatically. Food refrigeration preserves supplies. Bedding remains relatively clean and dry with little daily labor. A medieval morning began differently. The fire might have nearly died. Ashes required clearing. Fresh fuel needed arranging. Cold air filled the room immediately upon leaving blankets. Water had to be carried or broken from ice in harsh weather. Animals required attention before people fully woke. And because artificial lighting remained weak, winter mornings before sunrise could feel almost indistinguishable from the middle of the night. This made rising physically difficult in ways modern alarm clocks cannot fully recreate. Some households delayed activity until natural light strengthened because many tasks simply could not be performed effectively earlier. Others, especially laboring households, rose in darkness out of necessity. Servants and workers often began before dawn despite cold conditions because household survival depended on maximizing available daylight later. And all of this returned the bedroom repeatedly to the center of labor. Beds required maintenance daily. Straw shifted and compacted. Blankets needed airing. Curtains gathered smoke and odor. Parasites demanded constant management. Moisture damaged fabrics. Wealthier households employed servants partly because maintaining domestic comfort consumed enormous time and effort. The more refined the bedroom became, the more labor it required. This is another hidden irony of medieval comfort. Luxury did not reduce work overall. It redistributed work downward onto servants and dependents. A noblewoman sleeping beneath embroidered curtains and layered featherbeds relied on countless hours of spinning, weaving, laundering, heating, repairing, and cleaning performed by others. And because servants slept nearby, often in less comfortable conditions, elite privacy always rested on visible inequality. The quiet, noble chamber depended on noisy labor happening elsewhere. The warm bed depended on servants rising early to prepare fires. The clean linens depended on women washing and drying heavy fabrics in difficult conditions. The medieval bedroom, therefore, embodied the entire household economy within a single room. Even children's experiences of sleep reflected these hierarchies. Elite children sometimes gained separate nursery spaces supervised by nurses or attendants, though true isolation remained rare. Poorer children slept communally, often learning early to tolerate noise, shared space, and interrupted rest. And childhood nighttime fears were shaped by the medieval world as well. Darkness carried religious meaning. Folklore populated nights with spirits, demons, wandering souls, and supernatural dangers. Parents used prayers, blessings, relics, or protective rituals around sleep partly because medieval nights genuinely felt psychologically vulnerable. The line between religion and practical comfort blurred constantly here. A blessed candle or protective prayer could provide emotional reassurance as real as physical warmth. In a world where uncertainty permeated daily life, spiritual protection formed part of domestic security, and sleep itself remained morally observed. Oversleeping attracted criticism in many religious and moral traditions. Laziness was spiritually dangerous. Monastic discipline emphasized controlled sleep schedules. Household manuals praised orderly behavior and moderation. Bedrooms were places where moral character supposedly revealed itself through habits of discipline, modesty, cleanliness, and restraint. Even the arrangement of beds could reflect social anxieties. Who slept where mattered. Young unmarried women might sleep near female relatives or servants to protect reputation. Apprentices were monitored through shared sleeping arrangements. Guests required careful placement within household hierarchy. Men and women outside marriage were expected to avoid improper intimacy despite the crowded realities of domestic life. Privacy remained limited, but social rules attempted to regulate behavior within those limitations. This produced a fascinating contradiction. Medieval society simultaneously lacked modern privacy and worried intensely about sexual morality, reputation, and proper conduct. Households compensated through supervision, communal living, religious teaching, and social expectation rather than through architecture alone. And architecture itself still resisted full privacy for practical reasons. Corridors, for example, were relatively uncommon in many medieval buildings because they consumed valuable interior space. Rooms often connected directly through one another. To reach a private chamber, someone might pass through several occupied spaces first. This meant movement through the house remained socially visible. A servant sleeping near a doorway might hear nearly everyone passing at night. Children overheard adult conversations. Guests observed household rhythms unintentionally. Even elite chambers rarely achieved complete isolation. And because houses remained acoustically alive, sleep often occurred alongside ongoing activity. Someone ill might moan through the night, A late-arriving traveler disturbed bedding arrangements. Weather amplified itself through timber walls and roofing. Rats or mice moved audibly through structures storing grain and food. The medieval house breathed, creaked, leaked, and shifted continuously. To modern ears accustomed to sealed, insulated interiors, the sheer amount of sensory information entering a medieval bedroom would likely feel exhausting. Yet medieval people developed different thresholds of tolerance because constant sensory control was impossible. In fact, one subtle consequence of this environment may have been a different relationship with vigilance itself. People slept more collectively and perhaps more alertly. Parents remained conscious of children nearby. Households listened for signs of fire or theft. Servants anticipated calls from masters. Travelers guarded belongings in unfamiliar inns. Light sleep could be advantageous in uncertain environments. This may partly explain why segmented sleep patterns appeared workable in pre-industrial societies. If nighttime already contained interruptions, communal sounds, and periods of wakefulness, sleep could become more flexible than the uninterrupted modern ideal. And the bedroom remained deeply seasonal. Summer nights brought open shutters where possible, thinner coverings, and later sleeping patterns shaped by longer daylight. But summer also intensified problems of smell, insects, overcrowding, and disease. Winter compressed bodies together for warmth. Autumn introduced anxiety about fuel and food reserves. Spring brought dampness and mud tracked indoors. The house absorbed the agricultural calendar physically. Medieval interiors therefore changed character throughout the year far more dramatically than most modern homes do. Bedding shifted seasonally. Sleeping locations could change. Families moved closer to heat in winter and toward ventilation in summer where possible. And because lighting remained expensive, the bedroom was closely tied to natural rhythms of darkness. Candlelight created a softer, more unstable visual world than electric lighting. Shadows moved constantly. Faces appeared differently by flame. Reading after dark was difficult for many people unless wealthy enough to afford substantial lighting. The transition into sleep therefore happened gradually inside dimness rather than beneath bright artificial illumination. This slower descent into darkness affected evening social life. Storytelling flourished partly because spoken entertainment required little light. Prayer naturally accompanied the close of day. Conversation often gathered near the hearth because heat and visibility concentrated there together. Bedrooms inherited this atmosphere of gradual withdrawal from activity rather than abrupt isolation. And still, despite all the discomforts we have explored, the cold, noise, crowding, smoke, illness, and lack of privacy, many medieval people likely experienced moments of genuine coziness inside these spaces. That word matters, because comfort is partly emotional. A familiar room after dangerous travel. Warmth shared beneath heavy blankets during a storm. The sound of trusted family members nearby. Firelight flickering safely against darkness outside. A child sleeping peacefully after illness. The relief of shelter in winter. These experiences were real too. The medieval bedroom was uncomfortable by modern material standards, but it could still feel deeply human. In some ways, its very fragility intensified emotional attachment. Warmth mattered more because it was difficult to maintain. Safety mattered more because danger remained close. Companionship mattered more because isolation carried genuine risk. And perhaps this explains why beds occupied such powerful symbolic roles in medieval culture. Royal births occurred in bedchambers under careful witness. Marriage ceremonies culminated in the marriage bed. The sick received visitors in bed. The dying gave final instructions from bed. Important political conversations happened in chambers. Religious visions were reported from sleeping spaces. Beds were not background furniture. They were stages upon which life's most intimate transitions unfolded. Even legal records sometimes treated the bed as a marker of legitimate household order. Possessing a stable bed and domestic furnishings signaled respectability. To lack bedding entirely suggested poverty so severe that it threatened social standing itself. And this social symbolism only intensified as Europe moved gradually toward the early modern period. Bedrooms became more decorated. Household manuals grew more detailed. Furniture craftsmanship expanded. Textile markets flourished. Domestic comfort increasingly reflected cultural sophistication. But beneath these developments, older medieval realities persisted stubbornly. Fuel remained expensive. Disease remained common. Crowded urban housing continued. Servants still slept communally. Rural homes retained traditional layouts. And most people still lived far closer to environmental hardship than modern viewers can easily imagine. On a freezing January night in a 15th century village, a family huddled together beneath layered blankets still experienced darkness much as their ancestors had centuries earlier. Wind still pressed against shutters. The fire still needed careful management. Animals still shifted nearby. Morning still arrived cold. And somewhere beyond the village, in wealthier towns and courts, architects, merchants, nobles, and household writers were slowly redefining what a sleeping space could become, introducing new expectations about privacy, refinement, and domestic order that would eventually reshape European homes far beyond the medieval world itself. And somewhere beyond the village, in wealthier towns and courts, architects, merchants, nobles, and household writers were slowly redefining what a sleeping space could become, introducing new expectations about privacy, refinement, and domestic order that would eventually reshape European homes far beyond the medieval world itself. That slow reshaping did not mean that medieval bedrooms suddenly became warm, quiet, and private. The change was far more gradual than that. For centuries, old habits survived beside new ambitions. A wealthy household might add more specialized chambers while still relying on servants sleeping close at hand. A merchant family might enjoy a better bed and glazed windows while apprentices slept nearby in crowded conditions. A rural family might hear about newer urban comforts without ever experiencing them directly. This is one of the most important things to understand about the history of the bedroom. It did not evolve in a straight line from misery to comfort. It evolved through layers. New forms of privacy appeared while older forms of communal life persisted. Better heating entered some rooms while other rooms remained cold. Beds became more enclosed and elaborate in certain homes while countless families continued sleeping in shared spaces near hearths, animals, tools, and stored food. The medieval bedroom, in this sense, did not vanish overnight. It lingered in habits, expectations, and material limits long after the Middle Ages began giving way to the early modern world. And yet something fundamental had started to shift. More people among the prosperous began to imagine that a sleeping space could be personally meaningful in a different way. Not simply a place where the body rested. Not simply a place where family lineage continued. Not merely a site of birth, illness, death, service, and survival, but a chamber that could express taste, comfort, status, discipline, order, and perhaps even a degree of inwardness. This gradual inward turn would matter enormously. As homes became more divided, life inside them became more divided too. The hall no longer had to contain everything. The family could withdraw from servants more easily. Parents and children might be separated differently. Guests might be received in particular rooms rather than absorbed into the entire household. A bedchamber could become more selective, more controlled, more shielded from the constant movement of the house. But that came at a cost as well as a gain. Modern privacy can feel like freedom, but it also creates distance. Medieval crowdedness could be uncomfortable, invasive, and exhausting, yet it placed people physically close to one another through nearly every stage of life. The sick were heard. The elderly were nearby. Children grew up amid adult routines. Servants knew intimate details of their employers' lives. Families did not always have the luxury of concealment. A medieval bedroom was colder, noisier, and less private than ours because the whole structure of life around it was more exposed. The body was more exposed to climate. The family was more exposed to neighbors and servants. The household was more exposed to economic shock. The night was more exposed to danger, darkness, and uncertainty. And still people slept. They slept under wool and linen. They slept beneath curtains and on straw. They slept beside siblings, spouses, servants, strangers, animals, and dying relatives. They slept in castles whose stone walls held winter cold. They slept in townhouses where bells and carts carried through the darkness. They slept in monasteries where prayer interrupted the night. They slept in inns where trust was thin and belonging stayed close. They slept in cottages where the same fire that warmed them also filled the room with smoke. Their sleep was not always peaceful. It was often interrupted, communal, practical, and vulnerable. But it was also woven deeply into the rhythms of the world they knew. And perhaps that is why the medieval bedroom is so revealing. It shows us not just how people slept, but how they understood the boundaries of life itself. The boundary between public and private, between work and rest, between safety and danger, between body and soul, between comfort and morality, between household and world. A modern bedroom tries to close the door on most of those things. It muffles the street. It regulates temperature. It separates bodies. Protects possessions. It softens darkness with light. It encourages the idea that sleep belongs to the individual. The medieval bedroom did almost the opposite. It reminded people that sleep belonged to the household, to the season, to the fire, to the animals, to religious time, to social rank, and to the fragile material conditions that made each night survivable. That is why the cold mattered. It was not merely a lack of heating. It was a sign of how close people lived to the natural world. That is why the noise mattered. It was not merely inconvenience. It was the sound of a society where work, family, faith, danger, and animals remained near the sleeping body. That is why the lack of privacy mattered. It was not merely backwardness. It was the result of a world built around interdependence, hierarchy, limited space, and the constant need to share warmth, labor, and protection. To look carefully at the medieval bedroom is to see how much of ordinary life history usually leaves behind. Battles, kings, and cathedrals still matter, but they do not tell us what it felt like to wake before dawn in a room where the fire had nearly gone out. They do not tell us how heavy wet wool smelled after a storm. They do not tell us how a mother listened to a feverish child in darkness, or how a servant waited for the first call of the morning, or how a traveler lay awake in an unfamiliar bed, aware of every movement beside him. These smaller details bring the medieval world closer, not by making it romantic, but by making it human. The people of the Middle Ages were not simply tougher versions of ourselves, nor were they helpless victims of discomfort. They were people living inside a different arrangement of possibilities. They knew warmth as something earned and guarded. They knew privacy as something partial and negotiated. They knew sleep as something shared with the household, interrupted by obligation, and shaped by forces beyond individual control. And when we imagine them at night, we should resist both extremes. We should not picture only misery, freezing rooms, filthy straw, endless fear. But we should also not soften the past into candlelit coziness and embroidered beds. The truth is more interesting because it is mixed. A medieval bedroom could be harsh and comforting at the same time, could smell of smoke and herbs, could be crowded and emotionally reassuring. It could be a place of embarrassment, tenderness, illness, prayer, labor, and rest all within the same 24 hours. By the time Europe moved further into the early modern centuries, the bedroom's long transformation would continue. Fireplaces would improve. Chimneys would spread more widely. Furniture would diversify. Glass would become more accessible in some regions. Household layouts would grow more specialized. Privacy would gain new cultural power. Eventually, over many generations, the bedroom would become closer to the personal retreat many people recognize today. But something was lost in that transformation as well as gained. The medieval bedroom reminds us that comfort is never only a matter of objects. It is a relationship between bodies, buildings, labor, climate, money, and belief. A soft bed means little without warmth. Private room means little without safety. A quiet night depends on architecture, law, neighbors, fuel, animals, streets, and social order. Even the most ordinary bedroom is the product of an entire civilization's priorities. And so, when we think back to those cold medieval rooms, it may be worth imagining not just the discomfort, but the careful intelligence of adaptation. The curtain drawn tightly around the bed. The child tucked closer for warmth. The embers banked under ash. The shutters fastened before wind rose. The servant rising in the dark to restart the household fire. The murmured prayer before sleep. The sound of animals shifting below. The bell somewhere in the distance, marking an hour that most people could feel more than measure. These are not grand scenes, but they are deeply historical ones. They tell us how people endured ordinary nights in a world where warmth, quiet, and privacy were never guaranteed. And perhaps the most surprising thing about medieval bedrooms is not that they were colder, noisier, and less private than ours. It is that within those conditions, people still built homes, families, rituals, memories, and meanings strong enough to carry them through the darkness. They slept inside houses that breathed with smoke and weather. They woke into rooms that required work before comfort returned. They accepted interruptions because life itself was interrupting. And across centuries, slowly, unevenly, they began shaping the bedroom into something new. Not by escaping the medieval world all at once, but by gradually changing what they expected from the spaces where they were most vulnerable. So the next time we close a bedroom door, adjust the temperature, turn down the light, or settle into silence, we are using comforts that took centuries to become ordinary. Behind them stands a much older history of cold floors, shared blankets, open hearths, thin shutters, crowded beds, whispered prayers, and nights that were never fully private. And that quiet distance between their nights and ours may be the real story. Not merely that medieval people slept differently, but that their bedrooms reveal a world where comfort was collective, privacy was rare, and the simple act of resting until morning depended on the whole household holding together. If one detail from this journey stayed with you, it might be worth asking what feels hardest to imagine. The cold, the noise, the lack of privacy, or the closeness of everyone and everything around the bed. And if you enjoy calm, thoughtful history like this, you're always welcome to return for another quiet walk through the past.